at Narrator. And I think officially I'm in a data role, and my interests on a higher level lie in decision making. So, throughout my entire career, I've worked with data, but decision making is really kind of like what is the exciting piece to me. So how we make decisions, what actually is useful in data, in driving those decisions, and like getting people to act on the data. So that's kind of been a theme throughout all of the roles that I've had, and that I've like carried through still to today, and in my current role at Narrator. But to give you a little bit of background on kind of like how I got here, where I started. So right out of college, I started at IBM on their like corporate level marketing team, and in a data capacity. So that role was kind of like half data and half kind of internal PR, where we created these, data products to help marketers make decisions, and then we'd have to go around the organization and get them excited to use it, help them understand how to use it. So there was like already a lot of experience, half and half, in kind of like selling what we were doing, but then also creating those data products. After that, I moved over to WeWork, which was interesting in its own unique ways. So at WeWork, I was on the tech team, on the data team as a data scientist. And the way we're structured there is every data scientist was assigned to a product team. So the product team I worked with first was WeWork.com. So everything on the website, all the data, looking at, A/B testing, conversion optimization, and, what typically comes along with web analytics. And then eventually I moved into the machine learning team. So we were responsible for all of powering the product experiences within the WeWork products with data. So that was really interesting experience working alongside the machine learning engineers. But finally, I left WeWork and joined Narrator. So for those of you who don't know Narrator, we are a data platform where anyone who uses Narrator has access to these high quality handwritten data analyses that can essentially be turned on in minutes to answer your questions. So I won't go too much into the tech of kind of how that works, but our team, the data team at Narrator, is responsible for kind of creating those analyses, making sure, they're heavily vetted. We battle test them with our customers and kind of like generalize them so that for any customer's data, it always gives the right recommendation and the right results. So that's what we're focused on today.
Awesome. And just to start unwrapping all of that a little bit. So your degrees on operations, and then you started doing data analytics and data science stuff, which I understand it has been mostly like that bridge between the business and the machine learning side, which is cool, and we can talk a little bit about that in a bit. But how was that process from going from operations to data science? Was that something that you had to instruct and kind of teach yourself in that process? Did you have to like teach yourself Python, etc., to just start doing data science? Or how was that process? Can you go a little bit deeper on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say it was certainly more of a kind of like gradual transition. When I started studying operations research engineering, it was more kind of like on a whim. I was always interested in math and science, and when I got into the engineering school at Cornell, I picked operations research because it sounded the best at the time, but operations research wasn't really that popular at the time. I didn't have much awareness of what it was, but I was lucky enough to take a data mining class within the OR degree, and that was really kind of my first introduction to, it was essentially, data science models and overview. It was really broad. We went through all the different, standard modeling techniques and even implemented some of them by hand, which sounds crazy now, but it helped me get a lot of intuition about kind of like how these models are constructed and how they should be used. And that was really my first introduction. But when I started working, I would say that those skills didn't necessarily directly apply to my day-to-day work, because there's so much other stuff that comes along with working with data. There's getting the data together, writing the SQL, and all of these things that I think I got more experience as I did it on the job.
And that's interesting because, you went from a degree on operations and got into a role in data. Do you have any advice for someone trying to move into data, and how do they get started in that process? Is it just like, hey, I built my portfolio, I did like some work during my, I don't know, free time, and this is what I have, try me out? Like, how does that go?
Yeah. I would say the one piece of advice I would give for anyone looking to move into a data role is try and get close to the current data team at your company or a product team, anything that you can do to get a little bit of hands-on experience. I say product team because maybe you can work with their database and start answering simple questions like, people are using our or maybe even get access to the warehouse from the data team if that's available to you. But I say move into, get as close to the data team or product or any data capacity as you can first, because I think that it will help in gaining a lot of kind of experience in, what are the questions that I care about? How would I use the data once I have it? How easy is it to get the data? There are all these other things that come along with data that we don't always talk about when we're talking about getting into it, like tracking and access and things like that. So I would say, just try and like wiggle your way in some capacity, whether it's just like staying close to those types of teams, or offering extra help on the side, because I do think that hands-on experience can go a long way. And I know that a lot of people will try out those Kaggle competitions online. And I think like if you have the option to do kind of like a practical project at your existing company or with your existing team, even if it's not super, super cool and shiny of an application, I would say that working with real data certainly will go a lot farther than working with like a public data set, because it's much different experience than when you'll eventually be on a data team.
Cool. And just to clarify, in this Discord, most of the people that we have is developers that actually either want to go into data or are data savvy, which it's a huge crowd right now, of all of these developers that want to go into data science, or at least are interested to go deeper, or jump into that domain. So I think it's really important to them to understand, how can I make that shift, or how can I just like dive deeper into data and data science. So that's why I asked. But Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I was just quickly going to say, like, I think that's great, because most likely a lot of developers are already working with those product teams, are already working on the systems that are generating the data. So hopefully like access isn't as much of a challenge, and you can just like kind of get your feet wet by starting to ask and answer questions with your data. Start thinking about like, what are the things I'd like to know about our users? What are they doing with that data that's being captured?
Correct. Great. So moving on a little bit, I think, and following up with what we were talking about, that you had this great experience at IBM and WeWork, which are, you all know, huge companies. And now you're at Narrator, which is, I understand, a startup, and correct me if I'm wrong. How how were the data challenges different at a large enterprise versus this hectic and fast-paced environment working at a startup? Are they similar? Are they different?
Yeah, definitely some differences, but also some similarities too. I think the biggest difference was, when I was at IBM, we had a lot of resources and our systems were slowly changing. So from a data perspective and a data engineering perspective, we were all set because we had, a lot of time to create these data models, and we weren't moving from system to system and having to change the data model. So that was in a good place. I would say the key challenge at a really big company goes back to adoption. And, I said before, like this combination of data and internal PR for data is really true, because we could come up with the best approaches or the best recommendations, but getting someone who's, multiple teams away to actually act on that is a really big piece of the puzzle. So that was kind of the biggest challenge at a big company. And moving into like the startup environment, it's been very different in that everything's changing. We're using all these different systems, right? We're using our different CRM system, our different support platform, our email platform. And all of those systems are generating data, but then the data person needs to understand the customer. So we need to, which is like a little bit of that information's in all of those systems. So we need to bring it together, and the modeling becomes the biggest challenge. So making the tables usable for analysis and answering questions, especially when you're like changing sources that generate the data all the time, it really can become a mess in the warehouse. So that, I think, is something to definitely, keep an eye on, about how to like essentially build your data models in a way that are flexible to a changing environment, because it'll really slow down any data scientist, data analyst, machine learning engineer, anyone who needs to use the data. I think that challenge was a big one, certainly, with a lot of the companies that we work with today, the startups, and also WeWork was just changing all the time.
Yeah. When in your experience with WeWork and IBM, in terms of like the organization of the teams, did you guys had like this middle role, which is kind of like the business an analyst or the business data scientist that acts like as a bridge between data scientist and the business, or that didn't exist in those companies? And the reason I'm asking is because I kind of like, I'm starting to get that kind of like org as a standard, and I just wanted to confirm is if that was the case in those companies.
Yeah, it's a good question. Yes, it was. I would say it wasn't a formal role per se, but at WeWork, I would say almost every single role on the data team did work with kind of like business stakeholders. So even the BI team, which were creating the data models for reporting, even the data science and analysis teams were like working directly with those business stakeholders. I would say the only exception might have been kind of like more in data pipeline for data engineering. Yeah. But at IBM, we did have a lot more like specialized roles. Like people went really, really deep in one particular area. And in those cases, I would say, for some of our data scientists on the team, maybe 10% of their, maybe 10 to 15% of their role was kind of like external facing, making sure the results were interpretable and kind of explain the models that people would work on. But majority of the role was really working with the data and not like working with the business as much. But I would say, in my experience working with a lot of different companies now, it is, I think, hard to kind of like keep those things very separate. Yeah. I think it is really important to like maintain the business context when working on any type of data project.
Great. Cool. So when we were talking about this difference between large enterprise and startups, you mentioned actually that most of your time is okay. How I have to understand about everything, and I'm trying to bring everything and try to make sense of everything. So let's jump into like the tech stack. I've actually been reading about I'm not sure if I'm gonna say it correctly, but Narrator. And do you guys just use Narrator, or what does that stack in your case look like?
Yeah, great question. We do use Narrator. We use it a lot. I think I'm in Narrator for most of my day. But underneath that, so Narrator sits on top of a data warehouse. Mm-hmm. So our warehouse that we use is Redshift. Mm-hmm. And from an EL perspective, we're using Fivetran to get data into the warehouse.
Got it. And from that on, like, let's say, whatever is like data transformation. I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, what Narrator does is it brings everything to one table, and then you can start like even visualizing the different variables that you choose within the software, right?
Yep.
Okay, so once you do that, if you want to then send those things to the different business applications, etc., you guys, I guess, you build REST APIs and you connect them to Narrator, or do you guys have to actually share those results or models with each of the different business units?
Yeah, good question. So Narrator has a few, once you've created a data set in Narrator, you can send that data other places through a couple of different ways. One of which is using webhooks. Like if you want to send it to whatever product or application that needs the data, you can send it via webhook. But we also support, because we are transforming data, we also support views and materialized views, and even actually sending those data sets on a regular basis out to Google Sheets, which can be really helpful if you're sharing data with external teams and things like that. So there's a couple of different ways once you have the data to kind of get it out of Narrator and send it to the places where you need it.
Cool. Awesome. So you've also worked, I know with Narrator, you're working with a lot of startups. What are some of the trends that you've seen in data, popular tech stacks? Where is everything going, in your opinion?
Yeah. So in terms of trends that we've seen in data, definitely I feel that there's a trend moving away from BI and reporting and more towards analytics. So people are more looking for stories to understand their data instead of consuming dashboards. And this kind of goes back to that, decision-making aspect that I brought up earlier. But, a lot of times when we surface a lot of dashboards or data to people who need to make decisions, it becomes lost about how that's supposed to be used. And so there are a lot of companies now, Narrator included, who are creating analyses in story-like formats to make it easier for the person needing to consume the data. So I would say at a high level, that's a big trend that we're seeing, working with a lot of different startups. And for tech stack, the common tools that we're seeing are Snowflake, BigQuery, dbt is really popular for dimensional modeling, and BI tools like Looker.
Great. And I just want to remember everyone that if you want to drop a question, you can do it in the AMA discussion channel. That way I can share them with Brittany. So please do. I was actually gonna ask a question regarding that. You mentioned TDT, which of course is getting very popular.
Mm-hmm.
In your case, because you guys have kind of like a different approach, right?
Yeah.
Which I'm not sure if it demands some pre I would say like preparation on the data, or pre-modeling in a way, so that you can then start selecting the different variables. So how flexible, like I would guess first, like a technical person would have to make that pre-modeling of the data and like label, and then the different people in the business can go in and start like choosing the different variables. Is that correct? Like, is that the process, or is this something that where you need to bring in the data in a certain format so that the tool is able to work?
Yeah, good question. So, yes, in a way. So, the way that Narrator works is you are using the data in your warehouse. So, you would have, someone who can write SQL on your team, essentially mapping the data in your warehouse to the 11 column structure that Narrator uses. So, in traditional data modeling, the structure is custom. So if you have kind of like an analytics engineer or a data engineer who's doing your data modeling, they're kind of like thinking about what questions is someone eventually going to ask, and creating a table to answer those questions.
Correct.
But in Narrator, it's a slightly different approach, because in Narrator world, the structure is standardized, and you aren't essentially modeling your data in terms of questions. You're modeling your data in terms of concepts. What are your customers doing? What are the actions that your customers are doing? So that transformation step becomes very, very simple. Mm-hmm. And it becomes also very flexible, because once the data is in Narrator, you can really easily combine those building blocks, those customer actions, in different ways to answer infinite number of questions. So if you want to understand how many people were on the website and submitted a lead, you can answer that. But then if you want to say how many people were on the website, submitted a lead, and then called us afterward, that's a really easy kind of like click to connect the data across those three sources: your website, or your lead platform, and your support platform, without having to worry about like how that's joined in with foreign keys, or having your data engineer think up that question in advance, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Great. All right, moving on. What would you recommend that is just, or for somebody that it's just starting with data and ML? What would you do if you were starting a team? Like, what things would you have in mind or keep in mind, or what would you recommend, or what are the mistakes that maybe you did that now you know when putting together a data or an ML team? And again, the reason I'm asking is because a lot of startups that maybe they have, I don't know, a team of developers, maybe one or two are data savvy developers. They say, hey, maybe it's time to start, taking this to the next level. What are your recommendations in terms of that? And I bet that you see that a lot, since you guys work with a lot of startups. What's your take on that?
Yeah, so one recommendation I would give, and one kind of like common pattern that we see people jumping to when first starting with data, is about when to introduce machine learning.
Yeah.
So my recommendation would be use machine learning when you're ready, but make sure you can ask and answer the big ticket questions first.
Yeah.
So machine learning can be really, really, really powerful if applied in the right setting. It can be really, really powerful in setting that, it doesn't have a big impact, but you really want to kind of like choose your battles with machine learning and really focus your efforts on the parts of your business or the parts of your product that need it most. Mm-hmm. So I would say as a first pass for data, the kind of like main thing to get settled right off the bat is kind of big questions about the business and how customers are behaving. And then you can start to identify where are the areas where I need to bring in machine learning to, make us even better in this area that, 90% of our users are engaging with. As opposed to just jumping into something and you're optimizing, a part of the product that doesn't have a huge impact on, your customer's experience or the bottom line for your business. So that's kind of the advice I would give to start. I know kind of machine learning is typically the end goal for a lot of teams, so people want to start there. But taking small steps towards let's understand the business first, let's understand where to focus our energy, and then bring in machine learning to kind of get it over the finish line.
Yeah, great point. And just to finish up here, Brittany, with my last question, like, of course, you are in the startup world. You are seeing a ton of stuff. Any tech out there that excites you in the data space, stuff that you think, of course, besides Narrator,
Yeah.
but what's out there that you think it's going to be amazing, or that you guys are looking at, or that your clients are pretty excited about, or the team? Would love to hear that.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, obviously, I'm excited about Narrator because I work there, but I also work there because I'm excited. But aside from our product, one thing that we recommend to a lot of startups is using Fivetran. So I think a big hurdle to getting started using data is getting all of your data into one place. Yeah. And it's much easier to get a warehouse nowadays, and getting your data into the warehouse is something that I think a lot of teams invest a lot of time in custom EL pipelines, but we've seen teams go from having like no data capabilities to, having a warehouse, having EL, having insights in a much shorter time span because they've been able to get all of their data into one place easily and in a like structured, nice format. And I think Fivetran does a really good job of that.
And that's actually and of course, like that company and actually Stitch Data have been growing so much. And just mentioning Stitch Data, like, have you guys tried that before and compared them and said, hey, no, definitely? And the reason I'm asking is because this is a big discussion out there, right? Like, is Fivetran better? Is Stitch Data better? I'm not sure if you guys had the opportunity to check both of them out. If not, of course, we know that Fivetran is great, but would love to learn if you guys have done that process and maybe shed some light in terms of why one or the other is better or not.
Yeah, absolutely. So I will say that we have worked with both, companies who use Stitch, companies who use Fivetran, and we haven't had a chance to compare on the same data how the data looks differently for those two EL providers. But I will say generally, the reason why I like Fivetran is because it's very straightforward UI to use. So it's really easy drag and drop interface. I'm not entirely sure what Stitch does, if it's the same, but my experience with Fivetran is they have all of the ERDs available. You can really easily set up an integration, even if you don't have a technical background. And from a data perspective, I find that the data is much cleaner and much more structured, less duplication when using Fivetran. But again, we haven't done that side-to-side comparison on the exact same data set.
Yeah, and it's weird because there's people that say like, I tried to use Stitch and it didn't work. Then I went to Fivetran, it worked right away. But then you get people that say all the way around. But yeah, it's interesting, and I bet those companies are just going to be huge because everybody's just trying to send and funnel all their data into data warehouses. But
yeah, and it's surprising to me how many teams are still trying to kind of like build that custom pipeline when these tools make it so easy. And I have found that the teams who build it in-house often have frustrations down the line just about like upkeep, maintenance, and I think everyone should be at least checking out these tools if that's something that they're thinking about doing.
Actually, I was having that discussion with like a very important person in the Valley, and I asked him, why do you think Valley startups are always trying to build everything in-house? And he was like, I don't know, it doesn't make sense because in the past it wasn't like that. Like in the early beginnings, they didn't do that. But now it seems, he said, is to attract talent. Because if they can give those talent like projects to build in-house, it's much easier to retain them. I don't know how much that is true or not. But it is strange that companies spend so much time building stuff in-house that they can just get from a vendor. Obviously there's some stuff that doesn't make sense, but most of it makes sense.
Yeah, it is surprising. I agree with you. I think that it's interesting that people are still opting to build things in-house. But I do wonder if part of it is because a lot of, the big startups that we've seen become really big do publish a lot about these projects that they've done, what they've built in-house. But I think we forget that these now big startups, like they're not, they were small, but now they're really big and they have all of those resources to dedicate the time and energy to do it right. Yeah. And the little startups see the big ones and they're like, oh, we want to be like them. Yeah. So we should do the things that they're doing now, which isn't always, the best choice.
You're right. Well, just to wrap it up here, Brittany, you of course, like I've always wanted to have women in data as guests. In the past, I've had like a ton of dudes in here, and I'm really grateful that I've had like the past 3 AMAs with amazing women in data. So any women out there that you follow that we should follow, anyone you admire that you can recommend?
Yeah, one of my favorite people to follow is Cassie Kozyrkov. Okay. I might be saying her last name wrong, but she is awesome. She's the chief decision scientist at Google. And so the reason why I think she's really cool is because she has, a stats training, but a lot of her work, she has a blog, she has a lot of talks online, is talking about all of the decision-making bias that comes into data work, and more on like the practical side of using data in an organization. So I think she's awesome. Definitely check her out, Cassie Kozyrkov. Just look up Chief Decision Scientist at Google, and I'm sure you'll find her.
Actually, if you don't mind dropping the Twitter or LinkedIn on the general channel, we would really appreciate it.
Oh, absolutely.
We would love that. Well, Brittany, thank you so much for doing this again. I hope you have a great weekend, and for all of you, we're having the Christmas break now, and we're not going to have AMAs for the next, I think, 2 weeks. But we will be announcing many more guests. So thank you all. Thank you, Brittany, again. And not sure if you want to say some final words.
Just thanks for having me. This was really fun. So cool. I'll definitely be tuning into future AMAs as well.
Great. I really enjoyed it, and thanks again. Thank you, everybody. Have a good one.
Thanks.
Merry Christmas. Bye-bye.